The year is 1457, and the houses of Lancaster and York are at each other's throats, the Wars of the Roses just beginning. But in the safety of Pembroke Castle is a young noblewoman and her baby son, who will change the entire course of England's history, although they don't know it yet. That woman is Margaret Beaufort, and her son is Henry Tudor. Margaret had just given birth to her son Henry on the 28th of January after a traumatic and difficult labour, being just 13 years old herself. She was in the care of her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor at his stronghold of Pembroke Castle after her husband, his brother Edmund, had died of the plague just a few months earlier in Carmarthen. Events were moving quickly in England, however, and being a young wealthy widow with a baby made Margaret a vulnerable target for her title and lands. It was imperative she remarried quickly, and this time she decided she would make the decision of groom for herself. Jasper also understood the coming danger and helped arrange his sister-in-law's third marriage. But before any of this could happen, Margaret had to undergo her churching. This was a religious ceremony that dictated women had to remain apart from society for a number of weeks after childbirth before coming to church and being purified from giving birth. During this time, although Henry no doubt had a wet nurse and staff, as with all noble children at this time, Margaret made the most of spending time with her son and developed a strong bond with him. The groom chosen for her third marriage was Sir Henry Stafford, the second son of Humphrey Stafford, 1st Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was a powerful nobleman and a staunch supporter of Henry VI. He had actually tried to mediate between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, probably because he was in an awkward position as his wife was Anne Neville, sister of Cecily Neville, the Duke of York's wife. In other words, the Duke of York was his brother-in-law. Buckingham was also vastly wealthy with estates in England and Wales. Jasper had grown closer to Buckingham, and it's more than possible he suggested Henry Stafford. His family was a good solid choice, and Margaret knew marrying into the Staffords would ensure protection for herself and little Henry. After undergoing her churching, Margaret reluctantly left her young son at Pembroke in the care of his nurses and household, and she set off with Jasper for the Staffords' estate at Newport. Over 100 miles away, the journey was likely to have been an uncomfortable one, but it shows Margaret's determination to have her say in how her life would be mapped out, knowing that women didn't usually need to be present for their marriage negotiations, but her focus was on her son and his security. Henry Stafford was much older than Margaret at 31 years old, but ironically, he had never been married. This was partially because the Duke of Buckingham had been more concerned with the marriage of his eldest son, and partially because Henry Stafford suffered with ill health. A dispensation was required as they were second cousins, which was given on the 6th of April 1457, but Margaret still had to finish the required year of mourning before the wedding could happen. Margaret would likely have had her pick of suitors as a young, wealthy heiress who had proven she could produce healthy sons, so there is some speculation why she chose a man in his early 30s who had bouts of illness. As Henry was often infirm, and by the standards of the day, too old to be having his first child, it's possible that Margaret may have consciously chosen someone who she was unlikely to have another child with. The trauma of her labour and early consummation of her marriage may have affected her this much. Whatever the reason, she and Henry Stafford were wed on the 3rd of January 1458, most likely at Maxstoke Castle, a property his father owned. In later years, they would celebrate the anniversary of their marriage in style, so it was likely to have been a happy occasion. Margaret also had to, at least for the time being, bid farewell to her son. As a child related closely to the king, little Henry's upbringing had to be both safe and suitable, and it was decided the best place would be at Pembroke Castle with his uncle Jasper. Given the oncoming war ahead, it was thought to be the safest place for the child. While it was normal for royal children to live away from their parents in this way, it still must have been heart-wrenching for Margaret to say goodbye to her only child, especially when they had already gone through so much together. But Jasper always treated Henry as though he was his own son, and Margaret always trusted her brother-in-law without question. Margaret and her new husband Henry Stafford were permitted to visit Henry at Pembroke, and Margaret made sure she did this as much as possible. The evidence that exists of the relationship between Stafford and his stepson also suggests he was fond of Henry, and this could be at least in part because he and Margaret never had any children of their own. Just a short while before Margaret's marriage, there had been an attempted reconciliation in London between the King and Queen and Richard, the Duke of York, and his supporters. On the 24th of March, it became known as Love Day, and the King led a procession through London. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the Duke of York held hands as they walked along. But few believed it was a real reconciliation, and certainly the sentiments didn't last beyond the ceremony. In reality, both sides had been raising men for their respective armies. In June 1459, a great council was summoned to meet at Coventry, but the Duke of York and the Nevilles decided that it would be better if they didn't show, given that they suspected they would be arrested for raising their own army. On the 23rd of September, everyone gave up any pretense of reconciliation, and at Blore Heath in Staffordshire, the two armies met. Lancastrians led by Lord Audley ambushed Yorkists on their way to join their army. The Yorkists, led by the Earl of Salisbury, won a victory. But just the following month, on the 12th of October, the Duke of York and his men met with the Lancastrians at Ludford Bridge, and he had to flee along with the two Richard Nevilles. The Earl of Warwick, his father the Earl of Salisbury, and York's eldest son Edward all fled to Calais, while the Duke of York went to Ireland, where he was warmly welcomed by the Parliament of Ireland. This meant that Queen Margaret was now able to grow supporters for her husband, and she took York's place in taking control of the government. In November, Parliament was summoned to Coventry with three men not invited: the Duke of York and the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick. This was called the Parliament of Devils, and meant only one thing: that the three men were to be arrested for treason. By December 1459, the three men suffered the worst possible punishment for the nobility: attainder. This meant that a death sentence was placed on their heads if they ever returned to England. Their lands now belonged to the king, and their heirs would inherit nothing. It forced the Duke of York's hand, as now it left him with no choice but to invade England in order to regain his properties and fortune. He could either once again become Lord Protector, or, using his claim from King Edward III, denounce young Prince Edward, Henry VI's son, and claim the throne for himself. Their lands were handed out to Lancastrian supporters, and amongst those who gained were Jasper Tudor and Margaret's stepfather, Lionel Wells. On the 26th of June 1460, Salisbury and Warwick returned to England's shores, while York stayed to drum up support in Ireland. They had also gained control of Calais, important for keeping the support of wool merchants in London. The men and their army of 40,000 marched to London, where they were given a rapturous welcome. The control of the English Channel had meant propaganda could be more easily spread in the south of England, and so everyone firmly believed the Yorkists were there merely to be rid of the king's corrupt advisors, and that they were on the side of the king. Meanwhile, Henry VI was in Coventry when the news reached him, and thanks to the tireless efforts of his wife, he had 20,000 men to lead back to London with him. Queen Margaret fled with their young son Prince Edward to Eccleshall Castle in Staffordshire. Both armies drew towards Northampton. In an echo of the first battle at St Albans, the Yorkists sent a messenger to the king, asking to speak with him in person about their complaints. Unsurprisingly, after all that had happened, Henry VI refused. He had by his side as his commander Humphrey Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, and Margaret's father-in-law. Violence followed, but there was surprisingly little bloodshed, and the majority of the casualties were on the Lancastrian side. Henry VI was captured and brought back to London as a prisoner. Margaret of Anjou was left with no choice but to take her son and flee to Scotland. Margaret's family was shaken. The imposing figurehead of the Duke of Buckingham vanished as he was killed in the battle at Northampton, and as his eldest son had also died previously, his title passed to his grandson, also named Henry Stafford, who was still only 5 years old. Margaret must have felt more than a little uneasy. Big changes were coming. On the 7th of October, Parliament met with the absence of the king, and on the 10th of October, the Duke of York returned from Ireland. This time, there was no pretense, and it was said he marched into Westminster and claimed the throne for himself by sitting upon it. But many felt he had gone too far, even his own supporters. Henry VI was still an anointed king, and although Richard could claim descent from Edward III through 2 of his children, many were uncomfortable to shove a king off the throne. Parliament met again, and it was decided that Henry VI could remain king, but his heir was now Richard, Duke of York, rather than Prince Edward, and the Duke of York was once again named Lord Protector of England. Margaret of Anjou was horrified and led an army of men south provided by the Scottish crown. Many nobles in the north were bent on revenge for the deaths of their families caused by the Yorkists, and the Duke of York and the Earl of Salisbury ventured north to Sandal Castle. On the 30th of December 1460, for unknown reasons, the men came out from the safety of the castle and met the waiting Lancastrians in battle. York had underestimated his enemies, and he, along with his son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were killed. Salisbury was captured and later slain. Few mourned York's death, and for a brief moment Margaret must have breathed a sigh of relief that the chaos appeared to be at an end. But to take his father's place came York's son, Edward, Earl of March. He was furious at the deaths of his father and brother and was intent on avenging them, as well as taking England's crown for himself. By February 1461, Margaret and Henry Stafford had been lucky enough to view the ongoing war from afar, not directly involved yet and relatively safe. But that was about to change. Jasper Tudor and his father Owen Tudor were still determined to fight on, and they met the Yorkist army at Mortimer's Cross, not far from the Welsh border, leaving little Henry Tudor at Pembroke Castle. It was a disaster for them. Jasper fled the battlefield, and Owen Tudor was taken to the market square and beheaded on the 3rd of February. Margaret must have been beside herself with worry. While Jasper had protected her son, she knew Henry was safe, but with Owen dead, Jasper in hiding, and Henry still at Pembroke Castle, she knew he was in danger. On the 17th of February, the Second Battle of St Albans took place, and this time the Lancastrians were victorious. But despite freeing Henry VI and reuniting him with Margaret of Anjou, they were not wanted in London. Instead, York's son Edward marched into the capital and was met joyously by the citizens. He held the same claims as his father to the crown, and they were stronger than Henry VI's. Everyone was tired of Henry's weak rule and lack of control over his kingdom, and an agreement was drawn up that Edward would now become king as Edward IV of England. Margaret met the news with horror. Worse was to come. The time had come for her husband, Henry, to go into battle. Edward was hell-bent on destroying his enemies once and for all, and the Lancastrians and Yorkists met outside the village of Towton on the 29th of March 1461 in what became known as the bloodiest battle ever to be fought on English soil. The battle raged on for 10 hours, and Margaret's stepfather, Lord Wells, was killed. The meadow on which the two sides fought was to become known as the Bloody Meadow. It was a Yorkist victory, despite the huge numbers of dead on both sides, and it was enough to ensure Edward IV held the crown of England tightly in his grasp. Henry Stafford was now in danger, however, for taking up arms against his king. He had little need to worry though, as Edward was keen to make peace and get on with ruling his new kingdom. On the 25th of June, a pardon was issued to both Henry Stafford and his younger brother John, as they were cousins of the new king. Margaret's lands and money would not be forfeit, but there were other changes. In light of the leniency shown to them by Edward, and given that the shape of things seemed pretty fixed, both Henry and John switched sides to the Yorkist cause. Henry would sometimes be reluctant about this, but he was a loyal man and served the Yorkists without question. How much Margaret knew of his decision, or even if she had a hand in it, is unknown. Certainly, while Margaret's allegiance to the House of Lancaster was without question, she was intelligent and politically astute even at the age of 18, and Margaret understood when to quietly bide her time. During Edward's reign, she made efforts to maintain relationships with those once considered her enemies, recognizing that it was for the survival of not just herself and her husband, but also her son Henry. Not long after, in May, however, the king commanded that his supporters should take Pembroke Castle and its lands, having declared Jasper Tudor an outlaw. 4-year-old Henry Tudor was left to the mercy of the Yorkists, and Margaret could do nothing about the situation as her son became a ward of the king. On the 12th of February 1462, the wardship of her son was purchased by Sir William Herbert, and the 5-year-old set off across Wales with his new guardian to Raglan Castle, the main seat of the Herberts. It's likely that Margaret, given her obvious love for her son and later involvement shown in sources, probably petitioned for Henry to be allowed to live with her, or at least to have contact with him, but these were ignored by the crown. Thankfully, William Herbert and his wife Anne Devereux were kind and caring to Henry, taking good care of him and being responsible for his welfare. Also, luckily for Margaret, the Herberts were happy for there to be constant contact between mother and son, and Margaret sent regular letters and gifts to Henry by messengers. Henry's title was taken from him and given to the king's brother George, Duke of Clarence, but Margaret, and indeed William Herbert, never ceased referring to Henry Tudor as Lord Richmond. Margaret was probably living at Bourne, Henry Stafford's family manor, when she was as surprised as everyone else by the news that came out in 1464. The Earl of Warwick had been trying to arrange a marriage for Edward IV with a French noblewoman, Bona of Savoy. He was left stunned in September when Edward coolly announced that he was already married. Worse than this, his new wife was no foreign princess who could bring lands or riches to the crown, but a commoner, the daughter of a knight, Elizabeth Woodville. Knowing few would support his marriage, Edward had secretly married Elizabeth, with only the priest, her mother Jacquetta of Luxembourg, 2 gentlewomen, and a man who helped the priest present for the ceremony. The nobility was horrified. The king's mother, Cecily Neville, the Duchess of York, was outraged, and it distanced Warwick from the king. In July 1465, Henry VI, who had been a fugitive in his own country, was found and paraded through London, tied to a horse with a straw hat on his head. He would spend the next 5 years in the Tower of London, while his wife and son were safe in France, although working for his restoration. Margaret and her husband continued to display devotion to the new king, gaining properties and favours from him as a result. In 1469, the Earl of Warwick's displeasure with the king boiled over, and he raised a rebellion against him, alongside the king's brother George. Edward immediately called for his supporters, and many came to his aid to form an army, amongst them William Herbert, now the Earl of Pembroke. Herbert took with him his brother and the 12-year-old Henry Tudor, perhaps worried he would be kidnapped from Raglan Castle in his absence. The rebels won, and the Earl of Pembroke, along with his brother, was captured and killed. Young Henry Tudor had not only seen the devastating violence and chaos of the Wars of the Roses, but was now in terrible danger. Margaret and Stafford were hunting at Windsor when news came to them of Warwick's victory, and their accounts show that Margaret was panicked about what had happened to her son, as they sent one of their most trusted servants to find his whereabouts immediately. Meanwhile, Edward IV was captured, and Henry VI would briefly be placed back on the throne for a single year in 1470 due to the unrest caused. Margaret must have been relieved when the news came that Henry Tudor was safe. He had been taken by a relative of Anne Herbert's and returned to her at Webley Castle, the home of her brother Sir Walter Devereux. Rather sweetly, the Staffords' accounts show that Henry's stepfather was concerned his stepson should be entertained while at Webley, and paid for bows and arrow shafts to indulge his passion for hunting. On the 24th of August, Margaret and Henry Stafford travelled to London to negotiate with George, Duke of Clarence, about restoring her son's title and lands, but found him absent, instead at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. With the brief restoration of Henry VI, Henry Tudor was once again a member of the royal family. Jasper Tudor, no longer a fugitive, came to meet with his nephew, who he had not seen since he was a small boy, and took him to London. There, Henry was reunited with his mother Margaret. She hadn't seen him for at least 3 years, and given all that had passed, it was likely an emotional moment. Henry was also brought to meet the king, who likely just wanted to see the son of his beloved half-brother Edmund, but the Tudors would later spin this as a moment of prophecy. The story went that as the king washed his hands before a great feast, he told Henry Tudor one day he would govern all the land. Highly unlikely, given he had his own son, but great propaganda for the later Tudor dynasty. It was agreed that the young boy would stay with his uncle Jasper, but first he was able to spend time with the mother he barely knew in person. Margaret and Henry Stafford took her teenage son on a brief tour of the Suffolk countryside where they lived, spending time together playing cards and getting to know each other again. It was an impressionable moment on the young Henry, and he would never forget it, coming to respect his mother and her opinions implicitly. But Henry VI's brief second reign came to an end in 1471 with the Battle of Barnet. Edward IV had fled to Burgundy to the court of his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, who was married to his sister Margaret of York. She and Edward both persuaded Charles to help Edward regain the English throne, providing him with ships and money. On the 14th of April, Easter Sunday, Edward led the Yorkists against the Lancastrian army, headed by the Earl of Warwick, who was now in cahoots with Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI. Henry Stafford was present, but it's clear it was a difficult decision for him. The evident popularity of Edward's return meant he chose the Yorkist side, but parts of his armour had to be brought to him, and he hastily penned a will that was taken to Margaret. In other words, Stafford had decided only at the last minute. The battle was as bloody as any other before it. A mist covered the battlefield, and in the ensuing confusion, many of Warwick's men attacked their allies. It was a clear Yorkist victory, and the Earl of Warwick was amongst the dead. Henry VI was once again placed in the Tower as a prisoner and would die there shortly afterwards. Some sources state he died of depression, while others suggested Edward had him murdered. When Margaret heard no word of her husband, she ignored the danger and made her way to London to find out if he had lived or died. A messenger brought news he was alive but badly wounded, and he was returned to Margaret to be under her care. On the 4th of May, the hopes of the Lancastrians were firmly dashed with the death of 17-year-old Prince Edward, slain at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Jasper Tudor hadn't made it to the battle in time and was at Chepstow with his nephew Henry when they heard of the defeat of their house. They turned and fled to Pembroke Castle, well aware that Edward had proven he could be ruthless in victory. Apparently, it was Margaret herself who provided a solution to keep her son safe, but it was one that would cause her personal sorrow. She wrote to Jasper, begging him to take Henry abroad, ensuring his safety. Jasper replied that he would do so and would treat Henry as his own son. Margaret had only just been reunited with her son, and yet again she would be apart from him. She wouldn't see Henry for another 15 years. They came ashore in Brittany, under the caring protection of Duke Francis II. But there was more tragedy for Margaret. On the 4th of October 1471, Henry Stafford succumbed to the injuries he sustained from the Battle of Barnet. Margaret and the household fell into mourning, and it's likely she felt genuine grief at the loss of her third husband, becoming a widow yet again at the age of 28. They had been married for 15 years, and all records show they had an affectionate and amiable relationship. Henry's feelings are clear in his will, in which he referred to Margaret as "my best beloved wife." But Margaret was nothing if not pragmatic, and her main focus had to be Henry's safety, which meant she had to marry again. This time, she not only had to choose a strong family that could protect her and Henry, but also a husband who had links to the royal Yorkists. The man chosen was Thomas Stanley, a widower with noble connections, as his first wife, Eleanor Neville, had been a sister of Warwick. Like Stafford, he had tried to sit on the fence as much as possible during the conflict, but as his brother had fought for Edward IV, the new king had been convinced of Thomas's loyalty. Stanley was also part of the King's Council, so was politically involved and intelligent. He was given the position of steward of the King's household, which gave him a great deal of close access to the royal court. This was, once again, not a love match. For Stanley, he would gain Margaret's lands and fortune. For Margaret, she would gain a valuable connection at court, allowing her to petition the king on behalf of her son. The marriage seems to have been amiable enough, but again, Margaret may well have also thought of her fears about being pregnant again. In the marriage contract, nothing is mentioned for provision of future children, and Thomas Stanley already had 3 sons from his first marriage. By June 1472, they were married. Margaret was wed before her year of mourning was up, in fact, even before Henry Stafford was buried. While this may look callous, in reality, it shows how vulnerable Margaret was at this point. Over the 1470s, her husband was constantly required at court, which meant Margaret was there a lot as well. While this had been her intention, it was likely not pleasant at first, surrounded by those she had considered enemies for several years and still distrusted in regards to her son. But ever sensible to survival, Margaret endeavoured to make herself as amiable and publicly supportive of the Yorkists as possible. Meanwhile, her son Henry and his uncle Jasper Tudor were experiencing a change in circumstance in Brittany. While at first they had been welcomed guests, they were eventually separated by 1474, their English servants sent away and replaced by Breton guards, and they were not permitted to leave. It became clear, under pressure from both England and France, Duke Francis had decided they would be prisoners, but they were still well treated. In 1475, Edward decided to invade France and a great army was readied for battle. Margaret was likely amongst the crowds that gathered in London when Edward prepared to leave England's shores, as her husband Thomas was hugely involved in this undertaking. However, when the English forces left Dover in July and landed in France, there was no bloodshed at all. Instead, Edward entered talks with Louis XI, who pensioned him off, and a 7-year truce was agreed between them. No one was particularly impressed. Instead of a glorious victory, Edward simply became vastly wealthy, and King Louis could relax for 7 years. King Edward now turned his attention to the problem of Henry Tudor. He tried at first to bribe Duke Francis into handing over his important prisoner by way of bribes and promises, but the answer was no. There is at least one source that suggests Edward tried a ploy, pretending to want to arrange marriage between Henry and one of his own daughters. The same source states Margaret smelled a rat and wrote to Henry, warning him it was only a trap to make him return to England. Meanwhile, Margaret was busy making herself indispensable to Edward IV and his unpopular queen Elizabeth Woodville. The royal couple had 8 surviving children together, and it's likely that Margaret came to know many of them during her time at court. The eldest princess, Elizabeth of York, would later become Margaret's daughter-in-law, and all evidence shows they had a close relationship, so it is likely this might have begun during Margaret's early years in the Yorkist court. Margaret's charms appear to have worked on the Queen as well, as she was soon appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Elizabeth, as well as to 2 of her daughters. In the summer of 1476, the royal entourage travelled with the King and Queen to Fotheringay, Northamptonshire, in order to witness the reburial of the Duke of York and Edmund, Earl of Rutland. Margaret was there with Thomas Stanley waiting on the Queen, but she also joined her at the altar to make offerings. She was then present for the great feast given afterwards in Fotheringay Castle, a public symbol of peace between the 2 houses of York and Lancaster, and her acceptance of Edward's rule. But Margaret secretly only thought to secure her son's future. In 1476, Edward tried once again to get Henry Tudor on English shores. Duke Francis was finally convinced by one of his advisors that Edward would take good care of Henry, and arrangements were made for him to be returned to England. Henry went to Saint-Malo to await a ship and was handed over to English envoys. However, Henry recognised this as a trap, and while it's not known if this was his own deduction or by means of another urgent message from his mother, Henry feigned illness. He went into the cathedral at Saint-Malo, claiming sanctuary. In a move that violated the rules of sanctuary in a holy place, the English envoys tried to drag him from the cathedral. The townsfolk were horrified, and they came to Henry's aid, attacking the envoys and protecting him. Meanwhile, Jean du Quélenec, the Admiral of Brittany, convinced Duke Francis that actually Edward was not to be trusted. Francis changed his mind about the whole thing, once again placing Henry under his protection and sending him to be with his uncle Jasper, both of them welcome at his court. Edward's own family was not without drama, however. His brother the Duke of Clarence had increasingly become distant from him. After their reconciliation in 1471, they still often quarrelled, and in 1472, George was infuriated when his younger brother Richard married his sister-in-law Anne Neville. This forced him to share the inheritance of the Neville sisters from his marriage to Isabel Neville. After her death in December 1476, in which the Duke of Clarence violently accused what was likely an innocent woman of poisoning his wife, practically forcing the jury to find her guilty and condemn her to hanging, George's behaviour seems to have grown increasingly erratic. Edward IV then rejected George's ideas about marrying Mary of Burgundy, the wealthy heiress of Charles the Bold and stepdaughter to their sister Margaret, inflaming his anger further. In 1478, evidence was apparently found to link him to having plotted the king's death, and he was put on trial for treason. George was found guilty, taken to the Tower of London, and given a private execution somewhere within. Rumours came about that he had been drowned in a butt of sweet wine, a drink of which he was fond, but there is no evidence of this. Edward, however, seems to have later regretted his brother's death. For Margaret, it presented an opportunity. George had been the holder of the title that rightfully belonged to her son, the title of Earl of Richmond. While the urge to immediately petition the king must have been strong, Margaret had learned from her hastiness before and bided her time. Her caution paid off, and she continued to rise in prominence at court. In November 1480, Queen Elizabeth gave birth to her final child, a daughter named Bridget. Margaret was given the honour of carrying the child to the christening font, something that would have been unthinkable 10 years before. But sometime before June 1482, Margaret was once again touched by death, this time by her mother's death. Not only had the Dowager Duchess of Somerset been her main and only living parent, but they seem to have had a genuinely affectionate relationship as well. It's likely the passing of her mother came as a blow to Margaret, and it may well have been the reminder of the fragility of life that spurred her to make her next move. She decided to petition King Edward to have Henry returned safely to England. Edward actually agreed that if Henry returned to England and humbled himself before the king, he would be given a share of his late grandmother's estate to the value of £400. It was encouraging. Edward now had a firm grip on his crown, and he had 2 healthy young sons as his heirs. Henry Tudor was no longer the threat he had once been, and on an unknown date, Edward drafted a pardon for Margaret's son. It seemed that soon Margaret would once again see her boy. Christmas 1482 was cheerful for the royal court, at least until the 23rd of December, when Edward received word that Louis XI had signed the Treaty of Arras with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. This not only provided a truce between them, but Maximilian's daughter Margaret of Austria was to marry the Dauphin instead of Edward's daughter Elizabeth of York. He was outraged and instantly declared war on France. But before very much happened with this, Edward IV fell ill in April 1483. On the 9th of April, he died, leaving a shocked kingdom at his untimely death. But Margaret must have felt unease at Edward's death, thinking only of her son. Now that King Edward had died before turning his draft pardon for Henry Tudor into being, the future of Henry was once again unknown. On his deathbed, Edward had thought of his young heir, Prince Edward, who was still only 12 years old. This meant that a regent had to be appointed, and it was decided the king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was the noble for the job. He had been steadfastly loyal to his brother throughout the Wars of the Roses, was experienced in battle, and was popular and respected in the north of England, where his brother had put him in charge of keeping order. Margaret could not have known what was to come. She had gone from being so close to the realisation of her son's safe return home, to now not knowing what the future held for him or herself. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been a secondary figure in the king's presence until now, but now he held the reins of the kingdom as regent, and he would soon take the throne of England for himself in a shocking turn of events. All Margaret could do was once again use her pragmatic nature and intelligence to survive and to ensure the security of her son Henry, and she would do so with a surprising Yorkist ally. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.